Welcome to the Good Growing Podcast. I am Chris Enroth, horticulture educator with the University of Illinois Extension, coming at you from Macomb, Illinois, and we have got a great show for you today. We're going to be talking about native grasses and pollinators. Native grasses being wind pollinated. Do they need insect pollinators? We'll see what happens and how our native grasses support our insect friends. And you know I'm not doing this by myself. I'm joined, as always, every single week by horticulture educator Ken Johnson in Jacksonville. Hey, Ken.
Hello, Chris. Should be an interesting one. I think this is one that people don't usually think about as benefiting pollinators.
I will say, of the pollinator classes that I give, the images that I show on my slides, I don't know if I've ever had a grass and a pollinator. I've never connected those two things. It's always been wildflowers or forbs, purple cone flowers with all manner of insects on them. And so it's never been grasses. So yeah, this will be an interesting show.
Usually have one slide on grasses. So after this, I may have to put a few more slides in about grasses.
I think so. Yeah, we've uncovered a couple of benefits of our native grasses to our pollinators. And so I guess we should just dive right in. The only benefit that I would teach in these classes would be when it comes to habitat and the nesting provided by our bunch forming grasses. So what was that was my one slide. What was your one slide that you would include in your presentations?
It may be the habitat angle, well, that's nesting, overwintering, and then just the, I guess, design appeal to just kind of enhance the design of a landscape. Or usually to be the two angles I would look at.
So I guess that it might be useful to describe, how, what we're talking about when referring to like native grasses, at least here for us in Illinois. We were predominantly a tall grass prairie state historically. That would be big blue stem. That would also include yellow Indian grass. It would include switchgrass. I would say in some of the drier sites where you didn't have as much soil moisture, you would then be getting into little blue stem, Cytotes grama, blue grama grass, some of the more short grass species. So we're talking about warm season bunch forming grasses that sort of form clusters or bunches. They don't necessarily spread with rhizomes or stolons.
And I would say for today, probably focusing more on those smaller, the little blue stem, Cytotes grama, prairie drop seed, because you could put big blue stem in your landscape, but you may regret it.
Yes. Yeah.
They get code enforcement called on you.
Because big blue stem, true to its name, is big. And I mean, they do spread as like bunches, that cluster of grasses only gets so big, but big blue stem, it just takes over. It can be so aggressive. Same thing with yellow Indian grass, same thing with switchgrass. When people are wanting to put in native grasses into a home landscape, that's usually a smaller scale. I am normally steering them away or kind of recommending away from more of our historic tall prairie grasses, and trying to steer them more towards those short grass prairie species like little blue stem. And that's just because it's a little bit easier to manage those. I've seen several like prairie gardens, pollinator gardens, where they put a few things of big blue stem, and after about 5 to 10 years, that's all big blue stem. Because historically, we had large herbivores that would roam across our prairies, and they would their major part of their diet, like the bison, was grasses. I think I've read in publications in the past that 90% of a bison's diet, they're targeting the grass species. So with these grasses being such bullies, such aggressive, that knocks them back, that allows the wildflowers to then take hold and kind of reassert themselves, and then the grasses then kind of push them back out. It's this pendulum that swings in our prairies over the thousands of years that they were here. Which, do you have any bison in your yard, Ken? I don't.
As as much as cool as that would be, no, I do not.
Now, those fluffy cows.
Best I can do is a dog.
That's you do have a fluffy dog though, so oh,
Act as your own bison if you want some of that stuff.
that is very true. Yeah, so you're gonna have to and actually, I know a lot of folks that will they are farmers. They have CRP. They have some of that big blue stem because I think way back when NRCS used to say like, "Hey, you are required to have big blue stem or switchgrass or something in here," and so now they have to actively control those grasses. You know, if they're really trying to enhance their habitat projects, um, and so that the grasses just don't completely take over and there's no wildflowers.
Yes, but enough of the bad. Let's talk about the good.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. Let's talk about these good things. So, I guess let's go back to where we began, Ken. Habitat and nesting. So, describe to me what you would mean by insects utilizing our prairie grasses as like nesting habitat.
Yes, there's kind of two examples. I'm sure there's more that I can think of. But bumblebees, you often hear about, not, well, I mean, not often, but frequently hear about them nesting at the base of bunch grasses. So bumblebees typically are nesting in the ground, a lot of times like abandoned rodent burrows, some kind of hole or depression in the ground. But they all will also utilize like the bases of bunch grasses. They'll build their nests there. And again, these are social bees. So you've got a queen that's building this nest, laying the eggs, foraging. Once the offspring are born, or daughters, they will then take over that, and the queen just is laying eggs. But they're annual. This is a 1 year thing. It's not like honeybees, which will go on for years and years and years. It's an annual thing. So then in the fall, they'll send out new reproductive individuals, males and females. They'll mate. The queens will overwinter, and that colony will die off. But you often hear about them at the bases of bunch grasses. Hear about them in compost piles, stuff like that. So if you're incorporating these native bunch grasses, there's the potential that that could be habitat for bumblebees. Another one I think people probably don't think about are some of the grass carrying wasps. So if you're providing, if you have like the wood nesting blocks, or you're putting out straws or reeds for native bee species, as cavity nesting bees, leafcutter bees, mason bees, things like that. If you have some of those holes that are stuffed full of grass, that is a native wasp. Several different native wasp species will utilize those. What they're doing is they're going out and catching crickets, grasshoppers, things like that, and they will lay their eggs on. They'll sting them, they'll paralyze them. That keeps them alive. We'll take those back to those to their nests. They'll lay their egg on it. The larvae will eat it, and they'll kind of divide their brood cells with that grass. So if you got a bunch of grass sticking out of some kind of tube or some kind of hole, more than likely that's one of the grass carrying wasps doing that. I think tree crickets are kind of one of the main food sources for those. So those aren't usually getting into levels where you have to be concerned about them, but they are helping to manage those populations of those insects. And these are solitary, so you're not going to have to worry about them stinging you unless you grab them or step on them or something like that. They're not going to defend their nests like a yellow jacket or some other social wasp would.
If there's something I love, it is uncovering some type of a leaf cutting, grass carrying, some type of insect that is using vegetation to line their nest with. That is so neat. I did come across, I think it was a leaf cutter bee that was utilizing leaves, and she was packing this into a hollow stem. Oh, was it elderberry? I'm not. It was some cane forming shrub in the woods behind my house, and I was just moving things around, and the stem just snapped ever so like very easily, and I noticed it was just packed full of leaves and frass. I think it looked like frass, powder looking things. And I'll see if I can dig up a picture to send you, Ken, to throw in here of that leaf cutter bee in that hollow stem. It was very neat. I know I have pictures. The question is, can I find these pictures? It's-
Yeah, for like the grass carrying wasps, I've read about them in like the window tracks or sliding door tracks. You'll
Mhm,
find them a lot. I've got a picture of an adult feeding on mint that I can throw in here. I don't have any of them actually carrying grass. And I mean, I'd assume they'd probably use just turf grass too. But,
mhm,
they've evolved with our native grasses. So you might as well provide that. And the females will just go clip some grass, carry it back to the nest. So again, like leafcutter bees, they're not taking enough to do any damage to those plants.
mhm. So speaking of, you know, these wasps, bees that utilize the interior of other plants for nesting, you have some great articles. I'm thinking of your fall garden cleanup and your spring garden cleanup articles about how insects utilize our standing plant debris for overwintering habitat. Now, we talked about how bumblebees can utilize burrowing underneath these bunch forming prairie grasses. Um, they're able to find these little niches in that fine root system that these grasses have. It's a very the roots aren't very thick. They're finer. But they're more fibrous, creating more of that sod layer right below the surface. I think more protective. Um, and so, but can in terms of like overwintering insects overwintering in the grasses themselves, um, do you see any indication that they are using the above ground vegetation? Or are they like kind of bedding down near the crown of the grass plant?
Yeah, I think it'll probably depend on the insects and how they're overwintering. So you've got some that may overwinter as eggs on those plants potentially, or as larvae, or if you're pupating, those may be down in the ground or at the base or tied to that leaf debris. So we can get into this a little bit. Like our grass feeding caterpillars and stuff would be examples of that. They're overwintering more than likely in those plants they're feeding on. You got things like beetles and ground beetles and stuff will overwinter in grasses and plant material, and then they'll go out in the spring and feed on what we would consider pests, insects and slugs and things like that. So, having that habitat that they can overwinter on, like anything else, you have that habitat, they're going to stick around because they've got what they need. They're not going to have to go around and look for other habitat. They'll stick around in that landscape where you're providing them with what they need. Um, I wouldn't be surprised if you could find other insects. If you've got could be adult butterflies. Again, some species will overwinter as those. Bees and wasps. They have their reproductives overwintering. Some of the social ones. I've usually seen them more in like logs and stuff. But if you've got a thick enough layer of grass and stuff, I wouldn't be surprised. If you could find them there as well. As long as it's somewhere that's going to keep them kind of protected, and they like it, they'll use it.
Okay. So being March 11th right now, it's really nice out. It's so tempting to go out and maybe cut down your. I have several bunches of native grasses. Uh, you can cut them down. I do sometimes burn my grasses, um, but it's probably too early, isn't it? We really need to wait until we see a bit more green. Trees flushing out with their growth, seeing our lawns green up at least, because a lot of the insects, they are not being fooled necessarily by the warmer temperatures.
Yes, yeah. And in an ideal world, we would wait until you think about when you plant tomatoes. By then the soils have warmed up. It's in the 50s. Everything that's going to come out, it's probably come out by then. That would be a good time to clean up. But we don't live in a perfect world. And if it's your front yard, you probably most people would want to clean that up a little earlier. Um, so if you are cleaning up, you're cutting back grasses, cleaning up other plant material instead of putting that out in the lawn waste or shredding it or doing disposing it however you normally would. If you've got an area, stick that in the backyard in a corner until it warms up. So anything that is in there can then emerge and then dispose of it. As far as burning, you'd run into this with prairie burns too. Typically, when you're burning that stuff, you don't burn the entire area because anything that is overwintering in there is going to get burned up. So typically, you only do part of it. every year, just so you are saving some of that stuff that is overwintering. So
Yeah.
just don't do it all at once. Again, ideally, but that's
Yes.
sometimes easier said than done.
That's true. Very good points. Yeah, and I don't always burn every single grass in my yard. Sometimes I will alternate, and when I do, and I do try to delay trimming grasses back as late as possible. I will even see the green growth coming up from the crown of that grass plant. I will then take like the shears and just cut them down. I know a lot of folks have said, well, that stunts that green growth at the base of the plant. I've never encountered that. And I have multiple different species of grasses that I've done it to. Um, they seem to respond just fine. And by the time we get to mid to late season, they formed their flower, they've begun to form their seed head, and it's just like normal. So I've it maybe it takes a little bit longer for them to reach that higher its mature height for the year, but uh, I have not yet stunted or shortened my grasses by burning them later than normal. And sometimes I do it on purpose because I'm trying to rein them back.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'll probably do some cleanup this weekend. We've got our hell strip or boulevard, whatever you want to call it, area between the sidewalk and the road. We planted all native plants. But the neighbors across the street have several oak trees, so all those leaves get trapped in there. So we've got areas where we've probably got leaves 6, 7 inches deep. So I need to rake some of that out because that's going to smother the plant material under there. So I'll rake that out and probably just rake it into the lawn, um, and let it sit and probably and wait back on the cutting back and stuff. But we'll do a little bit of cleanup just so I'm not smothering stuff.
Well, Ken, this show is turning into a spring cleanup episode here. I guess I guess we need to get back on track. Some of the other ways that our native grasses can support our pollinators, our insects, that they have co-evolved with over the eons, and the other way is as food. Um, Now, when we were looking into this, you had uncovered a pretty amazing treasure trove of information from University of Minnesota about some of the ways that our native grasses can contribute to kind of that insect ecosystem. And one of those was as a larval food source for a lot of our caterpillars. And I noted in this Minnesota link that you had shared that they call out a couple specific native plant species. One of them being prairie dropseed, another one being I think blue grama grass. Um, these grasses, they note that you know even though they might not be visited as frequently by pollinators, their flowers, these grasses are still supporting pollinator populations by larval food sources. And so, like with prairie dropseed, there are several skippers that they spend their immature part of their life cycle, their caterpillar life cycle stage on prairie dropseed. And a lot of these skippers, they're very small caterpillars even. You may never see them. They feed towards the base or the crown of that grass plant. Um, and then that's how they spend their caterpillar life. They pupate into an adult moth or butterfly, and then they will feed on nectar and pollen resources. So it looks like with like prairie dropseed, this is what they've documented. They know that there are at least 6 native skipper butterflies that feed on our prairie dropseed, and this is just kind of based on observation. They say that there's probably more, but this is what they've been able to study and identify. They know that with blue grama grass that there is at least 13 butterfly and moth species that feed on them, including like other skippers, uh, Blake's tiger moth. Uh, there are skippers here I've never heard of. The Unca skipper, Leonard skipper, Mead's wood nymph, but they list them all out, and the and I think it's a lot of this larval feeding we never really think about. I mean, it happens to our oak trees. It happens to our forb plants. It also happens to our grasses that they are also supporting many of our native pollinators. Um, So yeah, there you have it. Native
Yeah,
grasses, larval food
yeah.
source.
I mean, yeah, and I'm as guilty as anybody. We focus on monarchs, and they want the after milkweed. We talk about oaks because there's hundreds of different species that rely on those. The flowers, yeah, we forget about the grasses, and probably because these butterflies and moths that are feeding on them are not the big charismatic ones that we notice or really care about. It's probably not the right term, but that's what I'm going to use. We just don't notice. So, and we've talked about this caterpillars of eastern North America.
Mhm.
So it lists a couple. So you talked about the skippers, subfamily Hesperiinae, which is the grass skipper. So we'll say all. Probably get myself in trouble because there's probably one exception. But all these feed on grasses um, as a larval food source, like least skipper, bluegrass, rice cut grass, um, peck skipper, barnyard grass, rice cut grass, which I'm not sure what rice cut grass is. But I mean, this doesn't list all of them. And the skippers, people have probably seen like the silver spotted skipper before. That's a larger skipper species that you see flying around. It will feed on, let's see, they list false indigo, locust, legumes, and stuff. That's probably one people have seen before. And then the nymphs and the satyrs, Saturnianae. So these are kind of brown. They have eye spots, but a little more. They're kind of drab butterflies. So again, stuff we overlook. But there are numerous species that rely on these native grasses as a food source. So again, just the more diversity of plants you have, the more diverse insect population you're going to have in your landscape.
Yes, provide larval food sources, provide nectar food sources, um, and and now I feel better about incorporating more native grasses. I already have a lot, but um, now I'm like, well, maybe I could go buy some more.
And sedges too, which aren't grasses, but um, so that book we mentioned, it's Gardening with Native Grasses in Cold Climates and a Guide to the Butterflies They Support. So this is from, like you mentioned, University of Minnesota, and this is available for free on Apple Books. So I know if you've got an iPhone or iPad, you can get it. We're not quite sure if you have Android, if you're if you can access that or not.
I have Android, but my phone is so old it's not loading for me. So I'll have to get back to you on that one on Android.
Seth, and we can include a link in the show notes to that. So if you are a non iPhone user or non Apple user, let us know if you can access it or not. Or and if you can't, hopefully you have a friend that does have an Apple product that you can access it with.
Yes. Find someone you can borrow their iPhone or iPad.
And and another one for food that I've observed, and I admittedly did not do an exhaustive literature review for this, but didn't really come across anything in the literature is bees feeding on the pollen of native grasses. So I've seen this in my own landscape. I don't think I've taken any pictures of it because usually the bees are really small. Um, but we were talking beforehand, we've both seen it on sweet corn, which obviously isn't a native grass, but it is a grass or monocot. That's it's related. Um, so I have seen it there, but I have seen it on our side oats grandma, and when that's flowering, I have seen small bees and stuff visiting that. So maybe not a major food source for them, but still, it would be a pollen resource for bees.
Yeah, I think it's probably an area where we need to do more study on that, but I have heard entomologists say that even plants that are wind pollinated, they will frequently find pollinators visiting those flowers, especially in pollen scarce environments. Like a lot of our kind of suburban or urban environments, you might find a lot of insects feeding on shade tree pollen, even though many of our shade trees, they're wind pollinated species. Um, I sat in on a session. It was led by Morton Arboretum entomologists, where they were talking about pollinators that visit flowers of ash trees. And it was very interesting, very eye-opening, because you think of some of those trees, ash, maple, things like that, where they are, that pollen is moved by the wind. But they said in these pollen depleted environments, very often insects are going to look towards these wind pollinated plants. And when I have encountered, I've watched bumblebees collecting pollen from the tassels of sweet corn. I recall looking around me, and it's just turf grass and, you know, thousands of acres of field corn.
Mhm.
There's not much else around for them. So it would make sense that these bumblebees are scavenging pollen wherever they can find it.
Yeah. So if you need another reason, there's another one for you.
Mhm. So I also I had this question about, insects going after pollen on grasses. So I did reach out to Angela Morehouse. Now, Angela, she is a biologist with the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission. So she is an excellent botanist. She is a fantastic entomologist as well. Although she'll readily admit she was never trained in entomology. But when you're out in the prairie botanizing all day long, you become, you absorb that entomology expertise, just because there's insects everywhere in a healthy prairie. So I did reach out to her and I asked her about pollinators collecting pollen from native grasses. So I'll just read what she said. She said, "It is not common, but insects will, on rare occasions, feed or collect grass pollen." And then she actually sent a few images that she gave us permission to use on this show. So I'll share this screen right here so Ken can see what I'm seeing. So she attached a few photos. This first one is uh, a Lasioglossum sweat bee. I don't know if I said that right, Ken. Lasioglossum. Uh, and it is collecting pollen from eastern grama grass. So here it is, a really good close-up of that sweat bee collecting pollen off of this grama grass, or gamma grass, sorry. And again, another image of that. And then she sent another picture. Um, these are sedge sitter flies, and they are on a sedge here, and you can just see they're all just hanging out, pulling pollen off of these flowers. Um, and I guess it's just true to their name. They're sitting on that sedge, hanging out there. Um, and so she's always out there taking pictures. She knows that there's bee photographers that have documented this, but she's not aware of very many like scientific publications that have documented like pollinator visits to native grass flowers. So some really pretty pictures. Encourage everyone this year, get out there, sit in a prairie grassland area, and take a close look at those flowers all around you. I bet you'll find a lot of insects out there.
Sounds like if anybody's looking for a master's or PhD project, there you go.
Yeah, just got to find that funding, and then
Yeah.
you'll be off for the races. All right. Well, Ken, we kind of covered this already, but maybe it bears maybe hashing over it again. When we talked about our native grasses to use, what exactly are we referring to? Again, we said folks maybe steer away from those tall grass prairie species like big blue stem. Um, really trying to look more towards those short grass prairie species, which are not as aggressive. And again, the the resources from Minnesota, just the ones that I shared, it definitely showed that the gamma grasses, the shorter ones, the side oats, gamma grass, and then our prairie dropseed, our little blue stem, they are all excellent larval food sources. And I would say the prairie dropseed and the little blue stem, and I would even say some of that blue grama grass, I would say is going to be very available in local nurseries. If not as a straight species, you can probably definitely find them as a cultivar. I know Terra as a prairie drop seed cultivar is popular. Terra is a bit smaller, maybe a bit more compact that could fit better into a smaller landscape. Um, and this is probably opening a can of worms with nativars. Um, so I can attest that Terra is a wild selection. It was selected from the prairie. There was no extensive breeding that went into this. It was just someone noticed a shorter, more diminutive prairie drop seed. There's another one called Carousel that is a little blue stem. That is also a wild selection. Again, no specific breeding went into this. It was actually selected down near Rushville, Illinois, out of a nursery out of there. So, and it's now kind of more, it's sold worldwide. So it's a Carousel, little blue stem, Terra, prairie drop seed. You could get your nativars, you could get your straight species. That, dear listeners, viewers, is up to you.
Something is better than nothing. We can
There
we'll
you
leave it
go.
at
I
that.
like that. Yes.
And for the book we mentioned, what's the title now? Let me look at it. Gardening with Native Grasses in Cool Climates. So, one kind of cool thing that they do in this is they list kind of the complete life cycle. They have what they call a complete life cycle table. So they have a grass plus a flower will help you with kind of this lepidoptera or butterfly or moth. So taking the larval food source, which would be the grass, and then a flowering plant that they're commonly found on either in the literature or in field guides and stuff. So just as an example, um, something like, let's find one that people would actually want to grow. Side oats, grama, and penstemon species, which would be hilltop little skipper. Now, I don't know if that's one we have in Illinois, but they have it in Minnesota. So they've got 20, 30 some of these different combinations. So, or little blue stem and purple coneflower would be Dakota skipper, Argos skipper, Poshike skipperling, oat skipper, Otto, Odo, however you say that. So these different combinations that would potentially work and stuff. So
I love that. So I remember being out in the prairie out in Kansas, in the Flint Hills of Kansas, having a biologist talk about how the native grasses and the forbs, how they grow in and amongst each other, how they support each other, from a structural standpoint. The grasses keep the wildflowers propped up. The herbivores come through where they eat the grasses. It is a whole community. Now, Ken, you're talking about these pairings of grasses and forbs and wildflowers. Oh, it gets deeper and deeper the more you learn. This is wild.
yeah, well, and like you mentioned with the support, I think that's one thing we overlook a lot in when we're doing our prairie plantings is we want the flowering, we want the forbs. We're not getting the grasses which are offering that structural support. I think Aaron Garrett in one of her Grasses at a Glance blog kind of wrote about this, where again, like you said, those grasses are supporting these wildflowers, so they're not flopping over. So, which I think is a common complaint a lot of people have is they flop because they're typically grown much more densely than we would in a residential landscape, and they've got these support nurse plants, whatever you want to call them, holding them up. Um, and you've got that competition too, so that kind of keeps things in check, keeps them from getting too big as well, because you do have that competition between plants.
And so this could then play into how, in a residential setting, you could design a garden bed to support insects and pollinators by having your, let's say, prairie drop seed as more of an edging type plant. You could then do a mass planting of, what have you, penstemon. You could even do maybe even a dwarf Joe Pye weed. Those grasses would help support those taller flowering plants, from that would allow them to be more upright, more visible, maybe from the sidewalk or the road, give you good curve appeal. And then having an edging of grasses, in like a line, that also indicates that you did this on purpose. It is intention. I think that's another valuable thing when we're trying to incorporate more native plants into our landscapes. Now, I was just talking to someone the other day. What does this mean by native plants? I'm like, well, they're really wild plants. They haven't necessarily been cultivated for generations and generations in a nursery to try to be the perfect little plant that stays in its spot, that is the same height no matter what, the same width no matter what. These are wild plants. Their genetics vary from plant to plant. So your little blue stem might be a little bit taller on one side than it is over here. I mean, there's soil conditions and sunlight, things like that play a factor, but also just the genetics. They're not clones of each other. They're wild. They go where they want. And sometimes a native planting can look a bit unruly. So if we give this a bit more of a design eye of intentionality, where we're edging plants, we're structuring them from like short up to tall, that I think will allow these to be a bit more accepted by a lot more, groups such as cities, HOAs, your grumpy neighbor, you name it. Just it can probably be more acceptable if we approach this, by trying to marry our human aesthetics with those needs of the native plants, and then how we can contribute, to kind of a larger ecological framework towards our yards. So,
Yeah, and even leaving a one more width of turf that's mowed around there makes it look intentional too. So having some mowed turf around it, for whatever reason, people associate that with that.
Like
okay.
it.
Yeah.
Yes. And if we go back to fire, sometimes these things do catch on fire, whether on purpose or accident. And having a mowed strip around them is a decent fire break strategy too. So I know we don't necessarily have to worry as much about wildfires in Illinois, but it does happen. There's actually a CRP controlled burn that occurred in Macomb just the other day that got out of hand and crept onto a neighboring parcel's woodland. So, things happen. I actually have my parents' property. It caught on fire when the neighbor kid who was sneaking a cigarette tossed his cigarette butt into the leaves in the ditch, and then it caught our cow pasture on fire. So, I mean, these things happen. So knowing that you're going to be creating these native plant gardens that are going to have a lot of debris that will need to be managed, and it's flammable. So just be mindful of that. Having edging, having structures, rock, benches, signage, all of that stuff, I think is helpful in the long-term management, maintenance, and acceptance of these gardens.
I have nothing to add. Put that perfectly.
Case closed.
We're done.
All right. Well, all right. Let me hop off this soapbox for a second. Whew, I got way up there. Well, that was a lot of great information about how our native grasses can help support our native insects, including our pollinators. Even if we don't necessarily think of native grasses as pollinator food, they are, and they can be. Well, the Good Growing Podcast is a production of University of Illinois Extension, edited this week by Ken Johnson. Ken, thank you so much for both editing and hanging out with me today, chatting about the benefits of native grasses to our native insect friends.
Yes, thank you. And yeah, like we said earlier, go out and study those grasses. See what's out there. You'll be surprised.
Take pictures.
Yes. And let's do this again next week.
Oh, we shall do this again next week. We have got some soil test reports to report back to you. So we've done some soil testing on some of the places where we garden, And we're going to go over those results with everyone next week. Well, listeners, thank you for doing what you do best, and that is listening. Or if you're watching us on YouTube, watching. And as always, keep on growing. All right. Well, that was a lot of great information about how our native glasses, my native glasses. Let me start over. We just have, man, we haven't acknowledged the fact that we got past 200 episodes and completely just didn't even realize it.